I've got the kettle on. I've got Edinger open. We continue. Ego and Archetype, Part 9. The cause of Job's ordeal is Yahweh. Through his dynamic agency, Satan. Satan's psychological role in the Job story is described cogently by Rivka Schaff-Kluger. He, Satan, appears here in full light as the metaphysical foe of a peaceful life and worldly comfort. He intervenes as a disturbance and hindrance to the natural order of living and steps in man's way like the Mala, Yahweh, as Satan in the path of Balaam. However, while the Balaam story concerns the experience of a clash of wills and blind obedience, a first realization, so to speak, that God's will, not one's own, must be fulfilled. In Job's case, it is a matter of conscious submission to God's will, born of inner insight. Satan is here truly Lucifer, the bringer of light. He brings man the knowledge of God, but through the suffering he inflicts on him, Satan is the misery of the world, which alone drives man inward into the other world. I'm just going to go check on the tea. The description of Satan, which must be acknowledged as psychologically accurate, brings him in close proximity to the figure of wisdom. Can't say that. Ecclesiasticus. The feminine personification, wisdom, is described in these terms. I don't know if that's some kind of segment of the Old Testament or something. In Ecclesiasticus, the feminine personification, wisdom, is described in these terms. Wisdom brings up her own sons and cares for those who seek her. Okay, sorry, I understand now. I'm not sure if this is a literature, but it's saying the wisdom is a feminine personification in Ecclesiasticus. Sorry, I'm going to do a bit of research on that. It's the feminine personification of wisdom is described in these terms. Wisdom brings up her own sons and cares for those who seek her. For though she takes him at first through winding ways, bringing fear and faintness on him, plaguing him with her discipline until she can trust him, and testing him with her ordeals. In the end, she will lead him back to the straight road and reveal her secrets to him. That's the end of the passage. According to this passage, wisdom puts her sons to the test, just as Yahweh did Job, through the agency of Satan. Sorry about the neighbours. The favourites of God receive the severest ordeals, i.e., it is one's potential for individuation that causes the test. John Donne makes this observation. The best men have had most laid upon them. As soon as I hear a God say that he hath found an upright man that fears God and eschews evil, Job 1:1. In the next lines, I find a commission to Satan to bring in Sabians and Chaldeans upon his cattle, and servants, and fire, and tempest upon his children, and loathsome disease upon himself. As soon as I hear God say that he hath found a man according to his own heart, Psalm 13:14, I see his sons ravish his daughters, and then murder one another, and then rebel against the father, and put him into straits for his life. As soon as I hear God testify of Christ at his baptism, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," I find that Son of his led up by the Spirit to be tempted of the devil, Matthew 4:1. And after I hear God ratify the same testimony again at his transfiguration, "This is my beloved Son, in who I am pleased," I find that beloved Son of his deserted, abandoned, and given over to scribes, and Pharisees, and publicans, and Herodians, and priests, and soldiers, and people, and judges, and witnesses, and executioners. And he that was called the beloved Son of God, and made partaker of the glory of heaven in this world, in this transfiguration, is made now the sewer of all the corruption, of all the sinners of this world, as no son of God, but a mere man, as no man, but a contemptible worm. Although the testing may bring wisdom, it is a fearful thing, and hence the Lord's Prayer requests that we be spared it. Do not bring us to the test, but save us from the evil one. Jung considers that Job was released from his despair through a process of increasing consciousness on the part of deity. Kluger reports the following remark of Jung in paraphrase. In his great final speech, God reveals himself to Job in all his frightfulness. It is as if he said to Job, "Look, that's what I am like. That is why I treated you like this." Through the suffering which he inflicted upon Job out of his own nature, God has come to this self-knowledge and admits, as it were, the knowledge of his frightfulness to Job. And that is what redeems the man. Job. This is really the solution to the enigma of Job, that is, a true justification of Job's fate, which, without this background, would, in its cruelty and injustice, remain an open problem. Job appears here clearly as a sacrifice, but also the carrier of the divine fate, and that gives meaning to his suffering and liberation of his soul. End of quote. Rudolf Otto, the man who gave the experience of the numinosum its first clear formulation, has used Job's encounter with Yahweh as an example of the numinous experience. I quote him at some length because the passage conveys so well his understanding of the numinous mysterium. And then Elohim himself appears to conduct his own defense in person, and he conducts it to such effect that Job avows himself to be overpowered, truly and rightly overpowered, not merely silenced by superior strength. Then he confesses, "Therefore I abhor myself and repent in the dust and ashes." That is an admission of inward convincement and conviction, not of impotent collapse and submission to merely superior power. Nor is there here at all the frame of mind to which St. Paul now and then gives utterance. Example, Romans IX 20. Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, "Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honour and another unto dishonour?" To interpret the passage in Job thus would be a misunderstanding of it. This chapter does not proclaim, as Paul does, the renunciation of, the realization of the impossibility of a theodicy. Rather, it aims at putting forward a real theodicy of its own, and a better one than that of Job's friends. A theodicy able, hopefully I'm saying that right, a theodicy able to convict even a Job, and not only to convict him, but utterly to still every inward doubt that assailed his soul. For latent in the weird experience that Job underwent in the revelation of Elohim is at once an inward relaxing of his soul's anguish and an appeasement which would alone and in itself perfectly suffice as the solution of the problem of the book of Job, even without Job's rehabilitation in chapter XLII, where recovered prosperity comes as an extra payment thrown in after quittance has been already rendered. But what is this strange moment of experience that here operates at once a vindication of God to Job and a reconciliation of Job to God? That's the end of Rudolf Otto. After reviewing the examples of his mighty works as presented by Yahweh, Leviathan, Behemoth, etc., Otto continues. Assuredly, these beasts would be the most unfortunate examples that one could hit upon if searching for evidences of the purposefulness of the divine wisdom. But they, no less than all the previous examples, and the whole context, tenor, and sense of the entire passage, do express in masterly fashion the downright stupendous, the well-nigh daemonic and wholly incomprehensible character of the eternal creative power. How incalculable and wholly other, it mocks at all conceiving, but can yet stir the mind to its depths, fascinate and overbrim the heart. What is meant is the mysterium, not as mysterious simply, but at the same time also as fascinating and august. And here, too, these later meanings live. not in any explicit concepts, but in the tone, the enthusiasm, and the very rhythm of the entire exposition. And here is indeed the point of the whole passage. Comprising alike the Theodikai, I think it's Theodicy. Comprising alike the theodicy and appeasement and calming of Job's soul. The mysterium, simply as such, would merely, as discussed above, be a part of the absolute inconceivability of the noumen, and that though it might strike Job utterly dumb, could not convict him inwardly. That of which we are conscious is rather an intrinsic value in the incomprehensible, a value inexpressible, positive, and fascinating. This is incommensurable with thoughts of rational human teleology, and is not assimilated to them. It remains in all its mystery, but it is as it becomes felt in consciousness that Elohim is justified, and at the same time Job's soul brought to peace. It's just a bit, it's deep. I'm struggling to come that deep. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to just read it again. The Job drama is personally applicable to all. It speaks immediately to the almost universal question, why must this happen to me? We all have an underlying resentment against fate and reality, which is a residue of inflation. Such resentment takes many forms. If only I had a better childhood. If only I were married. If only I were not married. If only I had a better husband or wife, etc. All of these if-onlys are the means by which one excuses himself from relating productively to reality as it is. They are symptoms of inflation, which will not grant the existence of a greater reality than one's personal desires. Job asked why his misery should happen to him. The answer that emerges from the book of Job is so that he may see God. Blake has captured the essential feature of the individuated ego in his picture of the repentant and rejuvenated Job. Wow. What is pictured is the sacrificial attitude. Having experienced the transpersonal center of the psyche, the ego recognizes its subordinate position and is prepared to serve the totality and its ends rather than make personal demands. Job has become an individuated ego. Wow. Wow. I'll put the picture up. Probably use it as the thumbnail. It's a good thumbnail. Part 4, the individuated ego. Individuation is a process, not a realized goal. Each new level of integration must submit to further transformation if development is to proceed. However, we do have some indications concerning what to expect as a result of the ego's conscious encounter with the self. Speaking generally, the individuation urge promotes a state in which the ego is related to the self without being identified with it. Out of this state, there emerges a more or less continuous dialogue between the conscious ego and the unconscious, and also between outer and inner experience. A twofold split is healed to the extent individuation is achieved. First, the split between conscious and unconscious, which began at the birth of consciousness, and second, the split between subject and object. First, the split between conscious and unconscious, which began at the birth of consciousness, and the second, split between subject and object. The dichotomy between outer and inner reality is replaced by a sense of unitary reality. It is as though original unconscious wholeness and oneness with life in which we began and out of which we had to emerge, we can now be recovered in part of a conscious level. Ideas and images representing infantilism at one stage of development represent wisdom at another stage. Images and attributes of the self are now experienced as separate from the separate from and supraordinate to the ego. Self are now experienced as separate from and supraordinate to the ego. This experience brings with it the realization that one is not master in his own house. He comes to realize that there is an autonomous inner directiveness separate from the ego and often antagonistic to it. Such an awareness is sometimes realizing and sometimes exceedingly burdensome. Exceedingly burdensome. Tell me about it. One may indeed feel suddenly cast in the role of Saint Christopher. The dawning realization of something living in the same house with oneself is often preceded by certain types of dreams, presenting the dreamer with happenings paradoxical or miraculous. Such dreams open a transpersonal category of experience alien and strange to consciousness. An example of such a dream is the following. The patient was a woman who was a scientist with a very rational, matter-of-fact mind. This was her dream. A man, a scientist of her acquaintance, was having a heart attack. He picked up a canna plant and clutched it to his breast. Immediately his heart attack was healed. Then he turned to the dreamer and said, "My fellow scientists may laugh at me for using this treatment, but it works and my children are too young to be left fatherless." This dream was followed a short while later by a singular experience of synchronicity that finally penetrated the dreamer's rational mechanistic worldview and was experienced as something impressive. Like the superorder in the earlier dream, it is as if the plant were able to drain off the effects of the heart attack and restore the heart to its previous state. The plant symbolizes the vegetative state of life. It is analogous to the autonomic or vegetative nervous system. On the psychological level, it represents a primordial vegetative state or mode of life experience that has a reservoir which can take up destructive excesses of energy that may accumulate in the conscious personality. This happening is experienced by the conscious mind as miraculous, i.e., transcending the categories of conscious understanding. Another example of the same theme is a dream of a man in the late 30s who had a very alienating childhood. Both parents were alcoholics, so the patient was obliged to assume precociously adult responsibilities and attitudes if the family was to function at all. Hence, he grew up into an extremely rational man, functioning well in a responsible position. But then he began to lose his bearings. He didn't like his work. He didn't know what he wanted. Progressively, everything he was doing lost all meaning. He was very difficult in therapy because we couldn't get beyond rational discussion. Then he had this dream. He met a strange and unusual woman whom he felt he had heard of before. She was an exponent of homeopathic medicine. After talking with her a while, he exclaimed, "How can you believe in such a thing as homeopathy? The latest scientific medical advice is always the best. Homeopathy is only a relic of primitive magic." In response, the woman smiled mysteriously and said, "Yes, exactly." At this, the dreamer was flabbergasted and awoke. In his associations to this dream, the patient said he knew nothing about homeopathy except that it used the principle of similarity. He was reminded of Fraser's account of homeopathic magic in The Golden Bough. Or Golden Buff, I think. Bough. And he also thought of my method of dream interpretation, the method of amplification, which brings similar images from mythology to amplify and clarify dreams. He had no associations to the woman, but she is obviously the anima who possesses the secret knowledge of the unconscious and is serving as a bridge between the ego and the collective unconscious. The dream indicates that the unconscious is being activated and is presenting him with a whole new mode of experience, something similar to primitive magic. According to this mode of experience, analogies are taken as realities. It is the method of associative and analogical thinking. This is the way the unconscious works, by symbolic analogy. It is the principle on which our method of dream interpretation is based. Amplification by analogy. It is completely erroneous to apply such a primitive mode in dealing with outer reality. That would involve us in magical and superstitious practices of all kinds. But it is precisely the right approach to deal with the unconscious and to make contact with the archetypal psyche. So it's the principle of dream interpretation. It's amplification by analogy. Modern man urgently needs to re-establish meaningful contact with the primitive layer of the psyche. I do not mean by this the compulsive expression of unconscious primitive affects, which is a symptom of dissociation. I mean rather the primitive mode of experience that sees life as an organic whole. In dreams, the image of an animal, a primitive, or a child is commonly a symbolic expression for the source of help and healing. Often in fairy tales, it is an animal that shows the hero a way out of the difficulty. The images of the primitive and the child serve a healing function because they symbolize our birthright to wholeness, that original state in which we are in rapport with nature and its transpersonal energies, which guide and support. It is through the child or primitive in ourselves that we make connection with the self and heal the state of alienation. In order to relate to the mentality of the child and primitive consciously, rather than unconsciously and inflatedly, we must learn how to incorporate primitive categories of experience into our worldview without denying or damaging our conscious, scientific categories of space, time, and causality. We must learn how to apply primitive modes of experience psychologically to the inner world rather than physically in relation to the outer world. Wow. We must learn how to apply primitive modes of experience psychologically to the inner world rather than physically in relation to the outer world. That is one of the heaviest sentences. That sentence could summarize almost the entire book. To be primitive in our relation to the outer world is to be superstitious. But to be primitive in relation to the inner world of the psyche is to be wise. Sorry. Jung achieved such an attitude of sophisticated primitivity, and that is why all who knew him could not fail to be impressed by his wisdom. Only a few days before his death, he was asked by an interviewer about his notion of God. He replied in these words, "To this day, God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path, violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse." The view Jung is here expressing is essentially a primitive view, albeit a conscious and sophisticated one. Jung is calling God what most people call chance or accident. He experiences apparently arbitrary happenings and meaningful. He experiences apparently arbitrary happenings as meaningful rather than meaningless. This is precisely how the primitive experiences life. For the primitive, everything is saturated with psychic meaning and has hidden connections with transpersonal powers. The primitive, like the child, lives in a world that is continuous with himself. He is in rapport with the cosmos. The more one attempts to relate consciously to the depths of the psyche, the more he is led to the same attitude expressed by Jung, namely, that all the vicissitudes of the outer and inner life have a meaning and expressions of transpersonal patterns and powers. Chance as a category of experience is a symptom of the alienated life. For the self-connected man, as for the child and the primitive, chance does not exist. Perhaps this is the meaning of Jesus saying, "Unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Oh, Jesus, he had it, man. He had it. Emerson expressed the same idea, namely that law lies behind all apparent chance. quote, "The secret of the world is the tie between person and event. The soul contains the event that shall before it. The event is the print of your form. Events grow on the same stem with persons." Each creature puts forth from itself its own condition and sphere, as the slug sweats out its slimy house on the pear leaf. A man will see his character emitted in the events that seem to meet, but which exude from and accompany him. There are no contingencies. Law rules throughout existence.